For today's lunch break, we're watching a Jesse video called Ryzeal is frustrating, with maybe I was wrong about Ryzeal in the thumbnail. Probably referring to, I don't know exactly when that video happened, a while ago at this point, where Jesse joined the Cybers hating crew and said basically, I think the gist of the last video in this series can be described as Malice bad, Ryzeal fine. Apparently he's changed his mind. I wonder what the reasoning for that is, because I still think Ryzeal is a fine deck. It is powerful, so maybe it's just a matter of deck that's powerful has been around for too long at this point.
A few weeks back, I made a rant video about my disdain of Malice, and people were pretty divided over what I had to say. A big talking point in the discussion is how I felt that the Malice board was not breakable. It was just an unmanageable amount of resources and disruptions met with a lot of follow-up, which to me felt like a recurring problem of last year with Yugioh and Snake Eyes. And while my opinion on that matter hasn't changed that much, there were
Okay, good. We still agree. That's good. That's good. That's good.
many people in my comment section saying that I was a hypocrite for disliking Malice when Ryzeal Fiendsmith was in some way pretty similar, being very strong with very good end fields and good follow-up. That is true, and also further exacerbated with the release of Eclipse Twins and Supreme Darkness, which further makes the field stronger, as well as it gives the deck even better follow-up. And you can do this all with just a bonfire or an ice Ryzeal.
That's a fair point. The initial discussion about this topic, I feel like, happened before Eclipse Twins was a thing, when it was like, yeah, the Detonator is powerful, but if you have an out to it, well, you know, one card to out the Detonator was sufficient to be able to not have to worry about it. Now it's different, because if they full combo into a Detonator with Eclipse Twins attached, one out will no longer do it. And I think that is a fair point.
And in many ways, that feels just like Snake Eyes.
In many ways, I feel like Ryzeal before Eclipse Twins was at a power level where I thought it was fitting for a quote-unquote best deck in the format. Like, it was manageable to the point where, you know, there were outs to its boss monsters. It didn't have crazy amount of Omni negates and stuff like that, and I was fine with it. Now that the Eclipse Twin has been added to it, and also now that like people are playing it together with Fiendsmith basically almost exclusively, it is getting a little bit more powerful than what I would like to be. I still don't hate Ryzeal, but I do kind of understand why people find it just a tad bit too powerful. It feels like the kind of deck that with a slight slap on the wrist could be like a fine best deck in the format again. But yeah.
Extension being relatively simple, where, oh, ice gets impermed, summon sword. My reason for protecting Ryzeal, or rather not hating it to the same degree that I would these past decks, is to me playing the Ryzeal mirror match, it felt more manageable. Largely in part when you had X Ryzeal on the backswing, after you were able to weaken your opponent's field even slightly, the game felt somewhat winnable. X Ryzeal into Mirror Logic Aggregator was, and still is, a powerful enough interaction point going second that it makes specifically Ryzeal mirror matches more tolerable. And because there are still...
I'm more scared about Malice and Mermail. I mean, on the one hand, I agree with you. I do think, I personally, once again, subjective, I rather play against Ryzeal than I play against Malice or Mermail, because I just think the concept behind those decks it's just not something I personally enjoy. Trying to win the game off of just making a board that no one can break. But that's also not the point, I think. It's not always about, like, I think people are always, or it's very easy to just deflect an argument. Like, oh, you're complaining about this thing when this other thing exists, which one thing existing that is worse than Ryzeal to you does not necessarily mean that Ryzeal is okay, or vice versa, or that like criticism is not warranted only because there's another thing that also deserves criticism. Do you know what I mean? Like, only because Mermail is a toxic deck does not mean you cannot have criticism for any other deck in the game, because then you always say like, oh, but what about Mermail? Like that's not necessarily, you're not wrong, but it's also not helpful for the sake of like discussing whether Ryzeal is a healthy deck or not.
Some clear choke points in the Ryzeal deck, like Duo Drive. If your deck is strong enough, you can weaken their field in a specific way that lines up with your strategy. That all made me appreciate Ryzeal a little more because it felt like it had actual silver bullets. It had weaknesses. It had a way to exploit it and get something from it. However, the more I have been exploring other decks, rogue decks in the formats, or even trying to make a budget Blue Eyes deck, I'm finding myself more and more faced with this problem of Ryzeal is frustrating. I understand why a lot of people have this opinion that Ryzeal is no better than Malice. The truth is, it feels...
I understand where we're coming from here. At the same time, I think that's pretty normal for a trading card game, not even just for Yu-Gi-Oh, but like the higher tiered decks, the quote-unquote best decks in the game, are not supposed to lose to like a budget version of Blue Eyes, which is like you throw together 3 structure decks and you're expecting to beat a better deck in the format. Detonator is probably one of the more outrageous end board pieces, but actually, is it? Because I feel like Detonator, if you compare it to other best decks in the game's history, I feel like Detonator is not the hardest piece to out. Like, I think when decks were making stuff like Appaloosa Baron or something, I think it's much harder to beat that with rogue decks than when it's like a Detonator. Like, it's better than like a Ryzeal as well. I'll take a Baron over a Detonator any day. Well, if it's just the Baron, then yeah. If it's just the Baron, I agree with you, but it turns out most meta decks that made Baron made more than Baron. The Ryzeal deck rarely makes more than the Detonator unless you're playing Fiends with Ryzeal, which at that point, I think it's a fair point. I think the Fiends with Ryzeal board from a rogue perspective is too hard to break. And I think another card that further exaggerates this problem is Dweller. I think Dweller is genuinely a card we should talk about more, even though it's already being, like, people are asking for Dweller to be banned, but like I think Dweller is a huge part of why Detonator is so powerful. Is if your opponent can make Detonator plus Dweller, like, you don't even have a choice but to like commit cards into Detonator that will not trigger in the graveyard. Like, normally one way you could outplay a Detonator is by like playing cards you know, with that have graveyard effects. Josh defending Ryzeal with full power Snake Eye was worse is not how you usually debate. Yeah, I didn't say anything like that in your band because I hate when people twist the words in my mouth. Like, you're just not actually trying.
Here in some sort of way. And it's a big reason why I have a complicated relationship with Ryzeal. It has good aspects to it, but also still has flaws that mean it probably won't be remembered as one of the best formats of all time, best decks of all times, or that fondly in general. And the thing that I think makes it somewhat related to tier is the aspects of the deck, the, you know, general gameplay mechanics, and the boss monster, in this case Ryzeal Detonator, are so overbearing that very few decks can keep up with it. The fact that extension is so free for the deck and every card replaces itself means that trying to engage Ryzeal in a grind game feels almost hopeless, and trying to prevent their field from happening is fine as long as you can deal with a Ryzeal Detonator. But Ryzeal Detonator is not a card that decks can just deal with. Ryzeal has X Ryzeal. X and Aggregator, as I said, deals with Detonator, which makes it not that hard to play into that mirror match scenario. And you can see when you're approaching Yu-Gi-Oh in that fashion, why that seems healthy. But when you are looking at this from every other deck, if I Imperm Duo Drive and on my hand is Blue Eyes cards, I think to myself, I don't have a good way of dealing with this. I have to invest several cards of my board into the Detonator. Now the next solution is just make Typhon, but Typhon requires you to be extremely vulnerable to your opponent's non-engine cards, which in Ryzeal is pretty plentiful, as well as it shuts off your ability to do anything else afterwards. So all you're really doing is stalling for more time, in which when you have to back yourself up with defensive cards, you can't rely on engine to actually get you across the line. It means you have to have an engine.
Like, So on the one hand, I agree. If you draw Imperm and 5 Blue Eyes cards, you're probably not beating Ryzeal. Like 1 Imperm and 5 Blue Eyes cards will not beat the Ryzeal deck. However, I don't know if I'm ready to call this a problem. I don't know if I'm ready to call my rogue deck has only drawn 1 imperm and otherwise like 5 subpar engine cards and is not able to beat the best deck in the format because of it. I don't know if I'm ready to say like, okay, Ryzeal is a problem because that's the case. Because I think usually it's, you gotta draw good cards to beat other good cards, you know? And when your hand has Blue Eyes White Dragon and an imperm and some like maybe 1 or 2 starters in it, yeah, you're gonna lose. Like, what are you expecting the best deck to do at this point, right? At this point, you're expecting the decks to just pass on nothing after an imperm? Because I don't feel like I don't feel like Detonator is so. My main takeaway from this is that from a competitive standpoint, I think what he's saying is from a competitive standpoint, Ryzeal is not a huge oppressive deck because other good decks have ways to deal with Detonator, right? Other Ryzeal variants or other decks with sufficient non-engine slots or good engine pushes. Like from a competitive standpoint, if you're also playing a competitive deck yourself, you can deal with Detonator. As soon as you get into the rogue categories, Detonator becomes very hard to deal with. I think is what I'm getting from this, which is not wrong, but I don't really know if that's something you can really change. Because some deck is always going to be the best deck, and the further you go down in quality in terms of decks, the harder it's going to be to deal with those decks. And I think Ryzeal on that scale is not as oppressive because any rogue deck can play Metal Tronus. And that's going to deal with Detonator all the time. I think the argument about Detonator is that it requires specific combinations of hands to be dealt with, like engine pieces in many decks are weak to specifically Detonator's interruption. That is true. That is something like there's a few decks. If you're coming from the perspective of like, oh, I like Centurion. Like, yes, Detonator will gatekeep Centurion like crazy. Detonator will gatekeep any deck where most of its starters are like, or important choke points are field spells, continuous spells, that sort of stuff. Detonator is crazy against that. And that's a fair point. That is frustrating from the perspective of I'm trying to play that sort of deck, right? Primite, some of the Blue Eyes cards, yeah, True Light and stuff like that. Like you cannot play with those decks under Detonator. The problem is there's always going to be like the best deck in the format is always going to have some sort of way of interrupting the opponent, right? Like we've been complaining about like, oh, we don't want the decks to have that many Omni Negates, right? Because Omni Negates are like kind of boring and too easy to use and too powerful. So like they're making other decks with different ways of interruptions. And obviously, there's going to be some decks that are weaker to those interruptions than others. And then it's just an unfortunate situation of like, well, if you cannot deal with Detonator with that specific rogue deck, then you probably just shouldn't play that specific rogue deck at the moment. I think it becomes problematic in the face of Ryzeal when you combine Detonator and Dweller into one deck, because now the top deck in the format basically kills everything that relies on continuous cards, but it also kills everything graveyard related. And if you combine those two things, then all of a sudden you've got like maybe like 75% of rogue decks covered, or maybe even more than that, right? So I wonder if this would be a problem if like I'm gonna take an example of a rogue deck. Let's say Unchained, right? Unchained would probably be completely fine and maybe even good against Ryzeal if it wasn't for Dweller, right? You can definitely build like a board breaker Unchained deck that cooks Ryzeal. I promise you can do that, right? Like you just play board breakers and Unchained cards and you throw board breakers at them and you Unchained and they just can't stop it. The problem is they just make Dweller. And then that covers both ends, right? That even covers most of your board breakers because it's not like the Dweller is not something you can out with Talents or Dark Ruler or anything like that. You'd have to have specifically Droplet or something, right? So like you can beat Ryzeal with Engine, but your options are relatively limited if they have access to Detonator and Dweller in the same deck. I think that's That's something I can definitely agree with. I'm not comfortable, or I don't agree with just calling Detonator itself the problem. It's a powerful card, but I think the way it interacts with most decks is fine. I think there's some decks that suffer more than others, which is natural. But I can definitely see how if you're combining it with Dweller, it becomes like a deck that is oppressive to too many decks in the format. Because think about it this way. If you're combining Dweller and Detonator together, essentially what you have is a Ryzeal. Because you eliminate Graveyard and you've got removal. I think that's a fair way to look at it. Like, a Ryzeal was a very, very powerful and format warping card that gate kept a bunch of decks because you needed specific outs to it if your deck needed the Graveyard. And this is like Detonator plus Dweller combined is a Ryzeal at home, essentially, right? So because the deck can do both, it has a similar premise where if Dweller was missing, I think you would see a lot more stuff that would be playable into the Ryzeal deck because it has like just good graveyard effects, so that popping your stuff doesn't matter as much.
That doesn't care about removal that much, or can somehow get the Detonator off the field quickly and efficiently, or you have to have enough non-engine that you can hold off your opponents in the way I said on the first turn, leave them with just a Detonator, but then also have the non-engine required to beat the Detonator. And for most decks, that's not possible. It requires an incredible amount of commitment to mathematically have hands that consistently deal with Ryzeal Detonator. That requires an absolutely enormous amount of hand traps. And then the other solutions is playing hand.
This is not true, by the way. This is not true. If it was just for Ryzeal Detonator, people would not be playing hand traps, because the things that have been said earlier are true. It is hard to hand trap Ryzeal. It is hard to prevent them from making Detonator if you're playing Imperm, Ash, Veiler, Nibiru Droll, and stuff like that. It is not optimal against Ryzeal. The reason why people are doing this is because Ryzeal Fiendsmith has a much higher ceiling than just Ryzeal, and because of decks like Malice. The reason why we're in a hand trap format, or why people are playing this many hand traps, is not Ryzeal Detonator. It just happens that hand traps are required in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Because of the Malices, the Fiendsmiths, and the Mermails of the world. And Ryzeal just works well in that environment because people are not playing, or I mean, people are playing good outs to do a Detonator, but these cards are, Ryzeal exploits these kind of cards. If it was just about Detonator, any rogue deck can activate Ultimate Slayer and the Detonator is gone. That is not a statistically impossible thing to do, to play Metaltronus and Ultimate Slayer in your deck. All right, like the Detonator itself, like is being made out to be much more of a problem than it actually is. I think it's much deeper than this, and there's other things happening that make people play the deck the way they are, and that makes Detonator powerful. But if you're just worried about Detonator, if your rogue deck is fine against everything in the format, but doesn't care about, but really sucks against Detonator, there's a lot of ways to do that. There's a lot of ways to deal with just the Detonator. It's not like you have to perform some statistical miracle to out the Detonator.
Mount hand traps. And then the other solutions.
Isn't that just draw the out like a Ryzeal? It is. But I think that is, while it's not a great thing, it's also not something that you can solve. Typically, funnily enough, the formats with cards that require you to just draw an out to them are, on the one hand, cards like people hate those kind of situations where you have to have an out to the card, otherwise you lose. But also, Kashtira format was a format where it was technically easier to perform with rogue decks because at least there were outs, right? At least there were outs to those cards. Because if people make super oppressive boards like a full power Tearlament board, that's a board that you can't draw an out to. That's a deck that pushes out rogue decks because you can't beat it with rogue, because their deck is not stoppable and not beatable with engine or even most non-engine cards. Like, that format was, you're forced to play Shifter or Tearlament. Two options. Like, that's the sort of stuff that pushes out rogue. Snake Eyes was the sort of deck that pushes out rogue and forces you to play 20 hand traps. Kashtira was not. During Kashtira, I didn't enter a single tournament with Kashtira during the entirety of Kashtira format. I topped multiple YCSs in that format with just decks that I liked. Of course, I had to draw an out to a Ryzeal, but like turns out in modern Yu-Gi-Oh, your opponent does things, you need to draw answer to those things anyways, no matter what they're doing. At least there are good answers to a Kashtira, a Ryzeal, or in this matter, a Ryzeal Detonator. So in some ways, this whole like, oh, you have to draw an out kind of situation is actually, I think, favorable for rogue decks in some way, shape, or form. I think something that's really hard for people to do right now, especially with rogue decks, is trying to have a split between Detonator is not the only thing you have to draw an out for right now. Detonator is not the isolated problem that people make it out to be, because if it was, it would be very solvable. The problem is you have to make the split between, you don't only have to worry about Ryzeal, you also have to worry about Malice, which is a huge chunk of the format and operates on a completely different level, like a completely different axis, because you cannot focus your deck around, oh, I'm going to try to play some outs to a Ryzeal, because then the Malice board just cooks you. The Mermails of this world just cook you, because combo decks are at an incredibly high power level. Decks like White Forest, Mermail, Malice, Memento, those kind of decks are still super powerful, and if you ever start ignoring those decks too much with your main and side deck, then you're just getting cooked by those. So it's just an environment where where Detonator really thrives, because people cannot afford to respect it enough. And also because of its pairing with Dweller, I think is when it becomes a little ridiculous. But the situation, like, I don't think it's fair to say Detonator is running out all these rogue decks from even being able to compete.
Is playing hand traps with breakers mixed, and you need to have enough of both that you consistently see both cards. And that's kind of what Malice has ended up doing, where the Bestials can act as breakers, as well as cards of Metaltronus and Talons kind of amplify that, as well as a couple other hand traps to make sure that you can kind of prevent the duo drive from going off. Malice is an exception where it's one of the few combo decks that can actually play a large amount of non-engine. And that's the reason why it's probably the only other deck that can succeed in this format at a large scale constantly, no matter the pilot. The more I've kind of seen the format evolve with cards like Gravekeeper Inscription and Barrel from the Never Dimension, it's kind of showed me that if you dedicate spots to Malice, similarly to how you beat Ryzeal, you could actually deal with it, although it still is very non-engine reliant. And that is a step in the right direction from where Snake Eyes and Yugioh were, where it was just not possible. It kind of showed that Malice only thrives in the way it does as good as it is the only other deck that can have enough non-engine to keep up, where non-engine is the most important thing right now. It just happens to be a combo type of deck that, if you're not prepared for, because you're preparing for Ryzeal, which is the more popular and truthfully the better deck, then you're gonna get caught without a good answer. And as a competitive player, that's obviously frustrating, and that's why Malice has been frustrating. You can't realistically do two things at the same time. You have to just hedge your bets on something, and it may backfire. And that's just not to say you can't edge out wins versus either Malice or Ryzeal with the tech cards for the other deck, but it is significantly harder. And it leaves us in a format where Tier was so overbearing that you pretty much had to build your deck directly to counter Tier, or it had to be Tier itself. Nothing else could keep up. It would get suffocated under the raw power of the milling, the shufflers, and so on.
Yeah.
The fact that you couldn't ever access your grave in a reliable fashion because of Dweller.
I find it concerning that we're even drawing a comparison between Tier Limit and this format, because I personally don't think they're comparable.
And the shufflers meant that most decks did not stand the chance. You had to play with just field effects, and Tier wasn't bad on the field by any means either. And it almost feels similarly with Ryzeal. Detonator pretty much says you can't play on the field. You need a way to deal with Detonator, or you can't summon cards, you can't use spells, you can't do anything impactful. And it's not like Ryzeal has no answer to graveyard effects either. It's not like it has this huge weakness. You know, Ryzeal Cross obviously demands an interruption because that does give you the safeguard from graveyard and hand effects, but also Abyss Dweller, a big problem I brought up before. That means you can't play a heavy engine deck that relies on graveyard effects and get there. And Malice conveniently fits into a deck that can sometimes push with engine. It doesn't need the graveyard, which is a very rare breed. So it's curious to me that Fire King and Mermail have had even some success, given how the odds look to be so stacked against them, given Ryzeal's dominance. And this all leaves a weird taste in my mouth, because I don't dislike Ryzeal mirrors. And Ryzeal is interesting in the fact that because of its flexible nature, we've seen several offshoots and builds of Ryzeal, with each having different upsides and downsides, weaknesses and strengths. That element to me is always cool. It always invokes a little more choice, decision, and it's not just show up with a pure deck and it's it. However, all those other problems where other decks can't exist means that it can get stale really fast. Even if there's some creativity, there's not much. And that's obviously not a good thing for Yu-Gi-Oh! While my opinions are wrong,
I don't know exactly if I'm understanding, like, I don't feel like these things are entirely true, to be honest. I feel like this is trying to cater to a lot of people just in the comments of the previous video who were saying like, oh, how dare you complain about Malice when Ryzeal is out there doing the exact same thing, which is just factually not true. The Ryzeal endboard is nowhere near as strong as like Malice, Mermail, or whatever endboards are. And I don't really know. Like, yeah, it's a good deck. It's the best deck in the format right now, but the way it interacts is not like that hard. Yeah, but the pure structure deck will have issues. Of course, the pure structure deck has issues. If you throw together 3 structure decks, you're gonna lose to the best deck in the game. I don't know. Like, what do you want me to say?
Ryzeal were better before. I am slowly starting to get a little bored of it, and I don't hate the deck, and I'm not trying to drive up animosity towards a detesting of Ryzeal. I'll be ready for the format to end. I don't want it to last forever, and I hope Konami does bring an end to it in a timely fashion, not just keeping it lingering around forever, because it does make other decks almost ineligible. I'd like to explore other themes, some other powerful decks that have come out over the past few months that can't exist without board presence. And
I think if Dweller is banned and the Fiendsmith engine gets a hit, I think we're completely fine. I think we're 100% overstating the power of a Ryzeal Detonator from the stance of competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Like, we're looking at this from a very, very casual lens right now, and I mean this in no negative shape or form. It's completely fine to play Yu-Gi-Oh! Casually, but when you're playing Yu-Gi-Oh! Casually, you're gonna have a tough time against people that are playing very competitively and are building the best decks in the game. That is always going to be the case. That is not even specific to Yu-Gi-Oh! Like, you're gonna have trouble. That is why the decks are rogue decks, right? And I don't even think the gap is particularly big right now between Ryzeal and other decks, because genuinely, if you're trying to do your thing with a rogue deck, all you need to do is activate one card like Metal Tronus or Ultimate Slayer that spins the detonator off the board, and you can start cooking. Yes, you need to draw those cards to out that thing that the deck is doing, but I don't know.
Ryzeal makes it just not existent. Now, one other thing I'd like to add is in all these other formats where they've had very powerful decks, we complained, like Snake Eyes or Yubel, where it seemed too powerful. One important thing that I mentioned was you couldn't really deal with that deck with non-engine. You needed it because you had to get lucky and had to really have a lot of non-engine and hand traps to get there, but breakers wouldn't work, and even then hand traps wouldn't always work either. Ryzeal, at least if you're playing the Ryzeal mirror match, then non-engine can get there a lot of the time, because your engine does at least something meaningful to close the gap and do the rest of the work when you're playing the mirror match. Where, again, that wasn't the case in these past decks. That is where it's a huge improvement.
But like, Blue Eyes also has just won regionals, right? I've seen regional winning Blue Eyes deck lists. I've seen a bunch of regional topping Blue Eyes deck lists. I started to look into Blue Eyes over the last week to get ready to also play it myself and do some deck profiles and stuff like that. And almost every single regional I looked at had Blue Eyes decks performing. Like, it won a couple, it topped here and there. Like, it's a new deck that, yes, it is weak to Detonator, but it's completely fine to do well with it. I don't really feel like there is a huge problem right now with Detonator.
But what that does still mean is we're driven by these formats that are incredibly non-engine heavy.
I think Dweller is a lot more of a problem.
It's even more so engine heavy decks struggle. That eliminates a huge amount of the archetypes and playstyles in the game, and I don't love that when that happens. Obviously that can just happen as a result of any higher power format, although it feels like we've had higher power close to tier 0 formats for almost 2 years now, ever since tier, with small breaks in between, but still, for the most part, really didn't have too many choices in the type of deck you wanted to play. And instead, you really have to pick a deck that can fit in around 20 plus non-engine cards. And then a lot of success for your tournament is in how you chose these non-engine cards. And that way it feels similar to Zoo, where Zodiac was also like that. It was an over-powerful engine that was present in many different variants. Mitsurugi Ryzeal, Draco Zoo, Infernoid Zoo, Fiendsmith Ryzeal. Still, all these could do well and win. If you weren't playing those engines, very few other decks could keep up. And then on top of that, the biggest key factors in their successes oftentimes is rather just the non-engine that the...
I don't know if engine heavy decks really struggle versus Ryzeal if Dweller is banned. And once again, I think that's the point that I can agree with. I think in the current combination of, if you combine all the things that Ryzeal has at the moment, I can see why it's oppressive, especially from a rogue perspective. That isn't wrong, because a deck that has Ryzeal engine, so it ends on Detonator super consistently. It has the Fiendsmith engine for crazy grind game and follow-up. It's got access to Abyss Dweller, so that's basically ruling out all the engine, because most engine heavy decks just lose to Abyss Dweller. That's just how it is. Most engine heavy decks have a lot of graveyard effects. That's just how it works. And then it also has a decent amount of room for non-engine itself. Like, it checks a lot of boxes. I understand that. It's a good deck. That's why it's the best deck in the format. I think if I'm looking at what is the problem for the format, what is the problem that is not letting rogue decks play the game to the level that they would like, I suppose, I think it's the fact that it just combines all those things together. As well as another problem here is the fact that you cannot really focus down Ryzeal fully, right? And that's another thing. I feel like that's a point where I think that's a good point to finally for rogue players to finally understand what I mean when I say diversity does not always necessarily make a format better. It can be, but it doesn't necessarily do that. Because if Ryzeal was the only deck you had to worry about, it'd be so much easier. It'd be so much easier, and you would not have to play the hand trap mini game against Ryzeal a single time. Like, the Ryzeal deck, no matter what version of it, is like you can play board breakers like crazy against it, and you'd be completely fine. But then you're just gonna get eaten alive by Malice. If you look at side decks right now, most people cannot afford to put in a couple extra Detonator outs for going second. Like, maybe you have like 3 cards versus Ryzeal in your side deck max, because there's other decks in the format that require very, very heavy siding, right? And that makes Ryzeal a bit more difficult to deal with because you can't focus on it. It's harder to focus down Ryzeal because it is not the most played deck by a huge margin. Like, yes, it's the most popular deck, but there's a lot of other stuff you have to worry about, which by itself already kind of like debunks the entire argument of it pushes out all these other decks because Ryzeal exists. Like, there is a lot of other decks right now. There's a lot of other decks that are performing, that are topping. Like, top cut breakdowns are relatively diverse because Ryzeal is not like Tier Laments pushing out all these other decks
utilized. It's not the worst thing for formats. Again, I want to reiterate that this is still a clear improvement from Snake Eye and
yeah.
Well, and yes, those non-engines still matter too, but it leaves a very different type of Yu-Gi-Oh than many different formats have come in the past. If Ryzeal the reign ends in a couple months, I'll be happy. It'll be an okay format in my history books, and I'll be happy to move on from it. I'm just worried that the game will suffocate, and that if Ryzeal persists for too long, then we get stuck in a kind of Groundhog's Day of non-engine being the necessity to win tournaments and Ryzeal mirrors being the be-all and end-all.
It bothers me that every time we're mentioning this, Ryzeal requiring a lot of non-engine, it's just a bunch of hand traps being slammed on the table, most of which are not in people's decks because of Ryzeal.
All of the game. I know it's funny me saying this, the person who praises tier mirrors, but those were a bit more interesting, truthfully. But even then, I also was done with them by the time that February came of that year.
But that is a general thing. I think it's completely fine. Like, to have the feeling of starting to get bored of a deck, I feel like that is just a very individual thing. That is subjective as to how long you enjoy a deck being around. So there's not really much to argue about in that regard. Like if someone says like, okay, best deck in the format is fine, but I want it to change like every month, then yeah, you're gonna get tired of Ryzeal really quick. I think another thing that people are more tired of is probably Fiendsmith. I think Fiendsmith is as much as I love the pure Fiendsmith decks, I feel like Fiendsmith just enhancing the ceiling of most of the Ryzeal decks just even more, I think is I think maybe that's what makes Ryzeal seem too powerful totally, like because I don't think it's Detonator. I really don't think so. Maybe it's just a matter of Jesse's getting bored of Ryzeal and just looking for problems where there are no problems really, or like at least not to this degree.
I think nothing for too long is good. Everything must have its limits. So let me know what you guys think. How do you guys feel about
like how long has it been? Like it's been 2 months, right? Like what was the first Ryzeal YCS was YCS Anaheim, and that was start of December. Right? 2 months ago.
Ryzeal, for me, it is a bit complicated. I often change my mind or my opinions almost event to event with the deck, where it's good for the game, bad for the...
I've never seen Josh say that there's something wrong with Yugioh. Well, then you're not paying much attention, and you shouldn't be talking right now. I'm so sick of people... Like, whenever I say something positive, it's like... You can't say that. You're Konami's strongest soldier. It's so stupid, man. Like I'm trying to make good points. I'm trying to be understandable. If you don't agree, that's fine. But please don't tell me I'm just saying the things that I'm saying just for the sake of it. Like I'm trying to make arguments. I'm saying negative things plenty of time. All right. If I wasn't allowed to say anything negative, there's so many things that wouldn't happen, right? I have my own opinions and I'm sharing my opinions. I'm allowed to be positive about things, and I'm negative when I'm negative, all right? And I am negative plenty of times about, dude, have you seen me ever talk about Malice? Have you seen me talk about MathMech? Have you seen me talk about plants? Have you seen me talk about Mermail? There is stuff in this game that I criticize. Have you talked to me the entirety of 2024 about Snake Eyes or Yubel or anything of that nature? Like it just bothers me, and I know I'm being one guide right now, but I just want to get this out of there. Like I say when I think there's a problem, all right? Believe me, there's nothing stopping me from criticizing this game if I feel like it's appropriate. And when I think there's a problem, I say that I think there's a problem, and if I think there's no problem, I say that I think there's no problem. And I didn't even say there was no problem during this reaction. I agreed on plenty of moments. I said like, yeah, I think Dweller makes it a little bit too powerful overall. I think the Fiendsmith engine might make the ceiling a little bit too high. I think not being able to fully dedicate your non-engine spaces to Ryzeal, which is not a deck that requires you to play a whole bunch of hand traps, but you still have to play a bunch of hand traps because other decks, I can see where people are coming from. Like I feel like I've brought my points across in a fair manner, and I don't really know how you can just say like, oh yeah, Josh will never say when there's a problem about you. I don't know. If you don't agree with me, that's fine, by all means. All right, but please don't twist the words I'm saying, and don't tell me I'm just saying what I'm saying for the sake of having to be positive or anything like that, because that is just not true. All right, thank you.